Can fiction be more than entertainment for Christians? Let's talk about it. Welcome to Truth Culture. Today we have an interesting topic. We're going to talk about fiction and how it can actually be a benefit to us as Christians and help us to think more deeply about the world that we live in. And with me today is author David Lopez, who just wrote a book called Novel One. David, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
And I just want to, allow you to talk about this book. We've been talking about it for a couple of weeks now, and I'm like, wow, this is interesting stuff. As you know, I love film. You walk in my office, you're going to see all sorts of movie icons. I love fiction. I like the story. I'm one of those people who likes to dig into and say, okay, what is this about? Is there a message here? What's the underlying themes? I like to break it down and rewatch it multiple times. And then we started talking, and I realized you have that same passion, but you're taking it to literature. And so please tell us, what is Novel One all about?
So Novel One is a dystopian, Lovecraftian science fiction story. The premise is that in a post-apocalyptic world shaped by the virus Novel One, twin brothers fight the odds in traveling orphanages called enclaves. I actually like what my editor, Ellie, had to say about this. She said, Novel One is such a weird concept. Forcing people together and making everyone stay outside is just a really weird twist on the coronavirus forcing us to keep apart and stay inside. It feels simultaneously genius and stupid. I honestly kind of love it, though.
Okay.
So the essence of my book is that my book looks at what people experienced from 2020 to 2021, but in a strange, bizarre way. And the things that we're really talking about here is extreme isolation, loss of family, and home abuse and trauma. And so these three experiences are means to look at three major themes that's found in my book. The first is existentialism, which is the idea that human existence, its nature and its condition, is the key problem. 2 is nihilism, that life is meaningless. And at the extreme, nothing in the world has real existence. And then 3rd is absurdism, which is the idea that humans exist in a purposeless, chaotic universe.
Okay, so those are some deep themes you got going on. And right before the show, we were talking about how TVs is so shallow these days. They don't go very deep. It's very surface. They kind of redo the simple story. And then sometimes they hit on topics, but they're always kind of the same ones over and over again. Now, you mentioned something, and some of our viewers may not be aware, but you mentioned H.P. Lovecraft. And of course, I've actually never dived deep into his books and short stories before, but I've seen his influence show up in movies. We were talking about Alien a while back, but a lot of people feel Alien is very Lovecraftian. But whenever I hear Lovecraft, I think of just this darkness and evil and gooey, uncomfortable, tension there. So you're trying to say something about our culture today in this very kind of creepy landscape. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, that is correct. My book, I don't want people to think that this book is Christian fiction as much as I want them to see this book as science fiction written by a Christian. Yeah. I don't have vulgarity in my book. I don't have sex scenes in my book, but there is a grimdark that's in this book that puts a stress on people. There was something that we talked about before, which is this idea that horror can put a stress on people. And my book attempts to put a psychological stress on people, a stress that I think many people actually experienced in their daily activities during 2020 to 2021. Yeah,
that's great. Now, you mentioned briefly the COVID. And did I say that right, COVID?
Yes.
And can you describe what that is and kind of how what it's trying to say in accordance to the book's theme?
So the COVID is an important aspect to the book's theme. It's mentioned in the back blurb, and essentially it's a mega region of bodies. I actually have an excerpt here that I would like to read
go for it.
About the COVID. The living megalopolis contorted in gruesome ways, becoming conjoined colonies of human limbs and ligaments swelling and shrinking as if single-celled organisms in time lapse. Fields of human flesh waft in the wind like stitched blankets as enclaves plumped and polymorphed toward the coven. Reaching the coven, they collided with this massive outer wall of heads and hands and were horrifically absorbed. forcibly transfigured into fleshly cathedrals. Inside, bodies linked and clamored atop one another, forming streets and districts and wards, and buildings from all eras of human history, all made up of jumbled up torsos, twisting like organic tesseracts. All roads led to the Coven capital, a monstrous organ that swayed and spied on all its inhabitants, a protozoic atrium, a protean Hilbert's hotel, a parasitic Tower of Babel. So the Coven is essentially the setting of this passage.
Yeah.
And the Coven represents my favorite kind of horror, Lovecraftian horror, also known as cosmic horror. And cosmic horror is weird fiction based on the fear of the unknown or the incomprehensible. And so I asked the question, how horrible would it be to live inside a monster, a malevolent god, if you will? And this question not only helps establish the world of novel 1, but it also helps our characters in the story explore existentialism, nihilism, and absurdism. But not only that, the Coven, this bizarre world of jumbled up bodies, represents dealing with the monster. And in horror stories, often people are running away from the monster. They're trying to get rid of the monster. They're trying to find out how to cast out the demon or run away from the alien. But in novel 1, the monster, the Coven, is inevitable, and you must deal with it to survive.
So just to clarify, so the Coven, from what you told me, is like the virus. The only way to get the virus is to be around people, right? And the Coven areas, because it's made up of bodies, it keeps you from getting that virus. Is that correct?
So there is a virus that turns you into an alien zombie.
Yeah.
If you are not within 6 feet of another person.
Okay.
And so over the years, people have clamored together to not get infected from this virus that they essentially have morphed into a kind of alienoid superstructure themselves, which is called the Coven.
Okay, gotcha.
So there is an external threat, which is the actual infection of the virus that turns you into this alien zombie. But then there is the internal struggle of living in this society that's been formed in response to the virus.
Wow. Well, you know, when you were describing that, I was thinking about I think H.R. Geiger type of paintings, which is inspired the design of the alien, but it was very organic, but it was mechanical at the same time. And I've seen it growing up in the 90s in several different types of video games where I think Doom was the first one that I saw it kind of put into it, where they use the organic design that makes up structures and all that kind of stuff. So as you were describing that, I had flashbacks of my childhood, and it's kind of some of the artwork I've seen of Geiger and everything, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's super dark, and I can't even imagine what that would look like, but it sounds horrifying for sure.
Yes. And essentially what I wanted to do is, just as in novel 1, the monster is inevitable and people must deal with it, COVID was the monster the world had to confront. Okay. And it was inevitable. Everybody was affected by it in some form or fashion. And so we're looking at characters. How are they responding to this Coven?
Wow. So you mentioned existentialism. And is there a particular part of your book that talks specifically about existentialism? And I totally butcher that word because it's one of those ones I may or may not get it right, you know.
There is a passage, and I can read it for us.
Yeah.
The Coven gurgled up Newt to its surface like an aching carbuncle jostling with pus to the nebulous rhythms of countless heartbeats. Pew's sunlight breaching corners of the rising tower like angels climbing Jacob's ladder. Clouds were so high and so far away, but so soft-looking that he imagined wrapping himself in them and falling asleep indefinitely. Putting a thumb to the sky and pressing as if on snow, closing one eye as he put his thumb over the tower, he removed his thumb and saw nothing, not even a fingerprint in the clouds. His life was hypothetical, a conceptual photograph of imaginary hands pressed into the air beside a photograph of their non-existent imprints. A definition or diagram without idea, sawdust cleared away. A boy that was not a boy, but doodle scribbled over instructions and Xerox copied endlessly into something less than white noise. One of my main characters, Newt, deals deeply with this idea of existentialism and what he is in relation to this body of other people. What is he as an individual? What is his life? in this passage, we're looking at atheism here.
Yeah.
And we're dealing with kind of the consequences of atheism. Atheism, when it comes to existentialism, carries this idea that the only way to fight back against nothingness is to embrace existence. Existentialism is big on the values of big on individual value, freedom, and choice. Humans define their own meaning in life based on their own subjective opinions. Humans try to make rational decisions despite existing in an irrational world. There is no God, so man must apply his own value to his own existence.
Yeah.
One of the points that I really want to highlight in this book is that existentialism offers no good grounding for human value. Now, what do I mean by value? I mean that there is no good and there is no evil. All moral decisions are morally equal, even if not behaviorally identical.
Yeah.
So whether you choose between rape or non-rape murder or non-murder suicide or non-suicide, those aren't identical behaviors that you might act out, but they are morally equivalent under an atheistic existential framework.
So what you're saying, if I'm hearing you right, is it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that if atheism is true, both sides of that spectrum doesn't really matter, essentially. So in other words, to murder or to protect life, it's pretty much the same, essentially. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's a scary thought.
It's a very scary thought, and especially when you push it to extremes, which is what my book is attempting to do, is to look at the implications of a certain line of reasoning or a worldview, and to reason back to the beliefs that these characters hold.
Yeah.
One of the issues when it comes to existentialism is this idea of having to deal with the bare, valueless fact of existence. Since all things all pass out of existence, our values are just expressions of essentially personal tastes.
Yeah.
And these personal tastes are themselves just socio-biological constraints on our Darwinian impulses passed on to subsequent generations by social conditioning. And so what we see here is that human nature is grounded in nothing but organic material and in a dying universe.
Yeah.
And that the human condition is grounded in nothing but finite primate brains, which essentially makes us not only stuff, but we're also animals. And then there's also this last issue, which is the human will. If we are anything but stuff, and if we aren't much but animals, human will is grounded in an illusion, or the delusion, if you will, produced by chemical reactions in our brain. And so essentially we're socio-biological machines in motion. And so the Coven gives me a setting to be able to talk about how people feel being a part of this, or being an organic cog, if you will, in this machine called the Coven.
So it really takes it to an extreme. Like if this was reality, let's take that idea and push it all the way into it and see what that looks like. As you're talking, I know there was a while that I was seeing in movies and TV shows of how it was wonderful to understand that when you die, it's you just, that's it. And it was very much built on existential thinking that we're just an organic thing that has guts and blood, and then when it dies, it's over. Game over. I'm like, that's horrible. But they were talking as like, oh, but that's what it's all about. I'm like, that's what it's all about. Is this you're just a bag of meat, and then when you die, that's as far as it goes. And they held it up like that was like profound and amazing. And I was like, no, that's awful.
Yeah. It's horrible. It really is horrible. And so there's the crisis of existentialism that characters are dealing with in this Coven world. And then there's also the other two issues of nihilism and absurdism.
Well, speaking of nihilism, is there a passage also that you can share with us that kind of talks about where you go with that? Because I know there's a little bit of overlap to some degree with those two.
Yes, and there is a degree of overlap because in the atheistic framework, you have to find replacements for God.
Yeah.
God provides the Christian with meaning, value, and purpose.
Mhm.
But if there is no God, those things have to be replaced with some other form of ideology, some other
point.
philosophical perspective.
Yeah.
When it comes to nihilism, here's a passage from my book.
Sure.
God was dead. This tower was the new sun keeping the unchained earth from plunging in all directions into the infinite nothing. Humans were just meat in a cosmic meat bag, animals who ate one another with faces just rows of teeth with no lips. Eyes for windows but no soul. Things happening now but not worth thinking about. Lives of such insignificance that to live forever would be a drag. Why pretend as if real meaning, value, purpose existed?
Well, hold on. Let me just interject here. Where you just, that's a good point, what you're saying, because if you're just a bag of meat and everything, and your only base of understanding what life is horrible, then why would you want horrible forever?
Exactly. What we're going to see is once we get to absurdism,
Yeah.
the only serious philosophical question in the atheistic perspective is suicide. Why should I face life bravely? Why should I deal with life?
Interesting.
Why should I exist in a world where I get little more than suffering?
Yeah. Those are heavy questions.
Those are very heavy questions that need to be answered.
Wow.
Now, we as Christians, we have a solution to this.
Yes.
Again, we can say that we have value in relation to God. We have purpose in relation to God. We have meaning in relation to God. So our suffering is temporal.
Yeah.
There is a greater weight to who we are as human beings than us just being a bag of meat
Yeah.
in a dying universe.
Yeah. Wow.
So looking at nihilism in relationship to atheism, it carries this idea. It's a profound skepticism about moral principles, and it's a pessimism about life. Nihilism is big on the non-existence of objective truths. Meaning, by definition here, as I hold it, is that meaning has to do with significance or why something matters. So value deals with the right or wrong of a thing, but meaning deals with why does something matter? Man is doomed to death. Man is doomed to die, and this is actually an issue in atheism called the threat of non-being, because when you die, you simply cease to exist. And the universe is doomed to die. According to science, there's going to be a heat death of the universe, and everything is going to die.
Sounds like the Bible.
Yeah. So
Judgment Day.
under nihilism, life may have subjective importance relative to some events, but making a difference makes no difference as all things die and come to nothing. It's important to understand here that meaning in the nihilistic worldview is culturally relative and personally subjective. And sometimes we get relative and subjective confused. Relative means varying with the circumstances, which actually is true. All issues in which we experience, in which there can be a set of propositions that are true, or put it this way, truth is relative to a circumstance. But that doesn't mean that truth is subjective.
Okay, that makes sense.
But subjective means that truth is just a matter of personal opinion.
Right.
So Christians would believe, for example, that truth is relative to some set of circumstances, but that truth is objective, that there is some facts, there is a standard to which these events relate morally. But in nihilism, there's no such standard. There's just the individual personal opinion about what's happening.
Well, you said a lot there, and it had my mind going into a lot of different directions. But boy, that seems to be the real struggle of our culture today, isn't it? When we're trying to sit across the table with somebody and discuss the hot topic issues of our day that are really moral issues, if you're dealing with someone who's nihilistic, that conversation can't last very long, can it? Because there's no sense of pleading, or let's look at it from a logical perspective, or if they bought into kind of a purposeless perspective of morality, then what can you do and say? And I think what you're trying to do with your novel is you're trying to show. One of my mentors always made this point. He says, you may hear an idea and think that idea sounds really interesting, but stop and think, where is it taking you? What is the end result of that idea? And I think what your book is trying to show is very much the end result of kind of buying into those ideas to an extreme kind of absurdity to it. But
Yes.
it makes you really think critically about, is this really a good idea?
I would like to take a step back real quick. I have a personal iceberg theory of storytelling.
Okay.
The part of the iceberg that is above the water would be the prose, the plot, and the personalities of the story. And good stories are here. They're mostly for entertainment. Below the surface of the water, you have the structure and the theme of a story.
Yeah.
And this is where great stories exist. I think, for example, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, which deals with trauma of war, and its format is very disjointed. Its structure is very disjointed. And if you were to remove one of those aspects, it wouldn't be what it is. But then at the very bottom is where you reach what I call the masterpieces. And the point of the iceberg deals with arguments/drama. Arguments are the ethics that the characters say they believe in the story. But the drama is kind of the meta ethic of the narrative. It's what the story is saying in relation to the characters' arguments. This book is trying to reach for that point.
Yeah.
It's trying to present in the strongest way possible the atheistic perspective, or existentialism and nihilism and absurdity. Is trying to give it its strongest case possible and say, does it win the arguments? Furthermore, does it win the drama? And the drama is more important.
Yeah. Well, there's a sense. I had a conversation with a guy who works in a university, and he was telling me that he's afraid that academia, the majority of academia has lost its, whether or not it's practical. It's like you can come up with these fantastical ideas, but does that really work in the real world? And I think that's essentially what I hear you saying, is that if you buy into existentialism and nihilism, is that a practical way of living?
I will mention more about the practical part when we talk about absurdism.
Well,
but
let's go straight into it then.
I will say this. When you find an existentialist, a nihilist, living a fulfilling life, it's not because of their atheism. It's despite their atheism.
Interesting.
Which is very different. To just summarize that, atheists live happy lives not because of their atheism, but despite it. And that is a major point that gets brought out in the book.
Interesting. I've never thought of it that way, but you're right. There are several people who bought into that who seem to have things that look like they're contrary to what they say they actually believe. I never thought of it that way. But speaking of which, you brought up absurdism.
Yes.
How does the book deal with that specifically?
Here's a third or fourth and final passage. Life was a painful exercise in self-delusion that grew no less absurd just because humans could give themselves reasons to care for it. For between any two reasons, who could say the more diabolical one was less preferable? He who was strongest, for truth had no value than survival. But then the will to survive wasn't just absurd and pointless, it was also twisted and cruel and self-deception, like this tower. The only serious philosophical question was suicide. Why face it bravely, or why face life bravely? So atheists who adopt absurdism is this idea that you're trying to find rational explanations for life, that finding rational explanations for life in the universe ultimately fail. Absurdism is big on life being practically impossible, which kind of goes to the point that you was mentioning. And this hits on purpose.
Yeah.
Purpose has to do with goals or reason for something. In absurdism, life has no design, no purpose. Life offers little more than suffering. And life's sole objective, at least for animals, is to simply pass on DNA. Life sucks. and it's on repeat until you die. The world is little more than suffering and pitiless indifference. Humans can't explain away all of these. Humans can't explain away this crisis with more faith, more thinking, and more doing. When it comes to absurdism, absurdism offers no real or satisfying solution.
Yeah.
What it says is, when a person is an absurdist, or at least the doctrine of absurdism essentially says, accept what life is and then just face it head on bravely. The problem is that if you're consistent with your absurdism, you're unhappy or unfulfilled. And if you're happy or fulfilled, then you're inconsistent with your absurdism.
Gotcha.
So again, it goes to this idea that atheism, with its existentialism, its nihilism, and its absurdism, it doesn't really provide much grounding for meaning, value, and purpose when it comes to living life as a human being.
Wow.
And my characters are children contemplating these issues in this coven. And so they have to face this crisis.
You know, it's interesting because it's when life does go through dramatic changes, and this sounds like everyone in this book is living through traumatic events. And I think that and conflict and dramatic events amplify what works and what doesn't. And I think, whenever they talk about the Great Depression, they talk about people jumping out of skyscrapers and killing themselves because the stock market crashed and they lost everything that they ever had. But those extreme moments really shows you what's in you. What do you believe?
Yes.
And they force you to examine, well, what is what I'm believing working for me right now in the midst of this chaos, or do I need to change the way that I'm, living? And, one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking about kind of the harshness of life and just pushing through it boldly and courageously. And I honestly, I don't know how to live life without faith in God. I don't even know how I would muster any type of power or will to move forward without knowing that there is a loving God who understands the situation that we're in, because we've fallen short and we've hurt him, we've violated that relationship. But those who are faithful in him, he will make things right at the end. And that's something I constantly think about all the time. And if you were to take that from me and what's left, I don't know what I would do, you know?
Because there is uncertainty in life, there is of necessity faith.
Yeah.
Everybody has faith because our observations about the external world and the internal world only go so far. We cannot go outside of our own minds to see whether we live in a matrix or not. The external world might be fake. We have no clue. But people have a line of reasoning that they then place their faith into. And they say, well, I have faith that the external world is real and that I at least exist and that there are minds other than my own. Yeah. So there is uncertainty in life which requires us to have faith. The question is, where are we going to put our faith? Yeah. There are those who put their faith in existentialism, nihilism, and absurdism, and then wrap it up and put a bow on top and call it atheism, at least their form of atheism. Yeah. And then there are Christians who have the same kinds of uncertainties, but they said, you know what? I have faith in the man Jesus. I have faith that Scripture is telling me truth about ultimate reality. I have faith that there exists a God. Now, faith doesn't mean we don't have rationale. Yeah. It simply means that we have followed the conclusions where it leads. Yeah. And we have warranted conclusions to express faith in said conclusions.
It's interesting. I was reading Hebrews 11:1, which says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And I like the ESV version because it uses the word conviction, but it says of things not seen, right? Yes. And the Christian walk is kind of absurd when you think about it, because we're convicted, and in other translations, that the word convicted can be translated as evidence, right? but evidence to things that are not seen don't seem to really stack up, and existentialism does it.
No.
You know, like they're not even compatible concepts, but to the Christian, they go together like this. But to someone who buys into nihilism or what the philosophies you're talking about, that sounds like cuckoo crazy, you know?
One of the things that I want to, going back to kind of the iceberg theory and trying to reach towards the point, you know, I would love for this book to be a masterpiece.
Yeah.
And audiences will decide whether it is or not. But the great masterpieces of literature, the great literary fiction that's out there, make a distinction between argument and drama. And the reason why is because it's a reflection of what happens in real life. There are a lot of people, a lot of atheists, who, in their minds, they win the argument, and yet they lose the drama. They might speak to their Christian friend who might not be as smart as them, or might not have looked into this as deeply, and so they get into a discussion and they beat them, and they, in their minds, prove that existentialism, nihilism, absurdism, that it is true. The argument is true, and yet they lose the drama because they're not living out the consequences or the conclusion of their arguments. Whereas the Christian friend, if they're being faithful, may not have won their arguments, but if they're being faithful to Jesus, they win the drama.
Yeah.
Because they're following the conclusions of their arguments.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting is a movie that's considered to be very cheesy and shallow, but is that I grew up with. Well, the made-for-TV version. You know, it's funny how much stuff came out in the 80s that you grew up watching on TV, and they had to cut out all this stuff, and then you watch the real cut when you're an adult, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know it was that bad. But Conan the Barbarian, I know that sounds surprising, but there was this concept. It was the riddle of steel that his father brings up, and Conan's father believed the riddle of steel was about the sword. And the will of the sword is what mattered. But then James Earl Jones' character, who's the villain, he believed really that the answer to the riddle of steel is actually the flesh, that it's about flesh. And what's interesting is the movie doesn't actually answer the question to the riddle of steel, because it's actually answered in Conan, who, because of what has happened to his life, he is compelled by his will to bring justice and onto what has happened. And so the answer to the riddle still is the willpower is what makes the sword matter, right? And this movie, when you would watch it, you're like, it looks really cheesy today. It's like, well, what did I just watch? But it actually has deep concepts in it that make you realize that, you know, if you don't have the right willpower, and that's tied to your belief system, I've seen Christians have incredible willpower that can push through being diagnosed with cancer and losing loved ones, but they know how to get back up and go forward. And you're like, wow, what willpower? Where does that come from? Well, the riddle of still to the Christian is faith in Christ.
100%.
You know, that's what keeps us going forward. That's what allows us to get to the end of the story, is because of faith.
100%. And I would guess that those Christians of indomitable will, faith in Christ, they might not have all the arguments laid down in defense of Christianity or why God exists, but they do have arguments, and they're living out their will based upon those arguments. And by doing so, they're winning the drama. Yeah. They're showing that Christ gives them meaning, value, and purpose, despite their personal limitations or intellectual capacities or resources, whatever it may be. Christ gives them meaning, purpose, and value, and they're living that out every day, despite the suffering and the chaos in the world.
Amen. Well, thank you, David. I think you answered the question. Can fiction be more than entertainment to the Christian? I think you showed, yes, when you read a story, watch a movie, go deep into it. However, hopefully you made some of the listeners interested. I need to check out this Novel One book, because it sounds like this Christian author is trying to deal with some heavy stuff. And maybe if you're watching the show, maybe you have friends who are atheists, or they actually are very much into nihilism. And this is a great way to kind of get into that mindset and try to understand where they're coming from. But before we close out, can you let the viewer or listener know where they can pick up a copy of Novel One?
Yes, they can pick up a copy off of Amazon, type in Novel 1, Darrell Lopez, or go to my website, durrell.com, DURRELLEL.com, and it'll direct you to the channels in which where you can purchase a copy.
Well, thank you so much, David. Thank you for coming on the show. And thank you. And I hope you watch next time on Truth Culture. God bless.